In this continuing series on life, love, loss, today we're concentrating on loss. As Woody Allen says, I'm not afraid of death, it's just that I don't want to be there when it happens. I today am sharing with you some of my experience of death and dying, grief and loss in Australia and China, beginning with my childhood here in Hobart. Fortunately, I was introduced to the idea of death by my mother when I was a very small child, living on the top third floor of the maternal family fruit shop, Henry & Co. in Liverpool Street. When our mother told my sister and me, whatever you do when you grow up, don't put me in a home and don't burn me. Not that we understood what was meant, and our mother changed her mind in principle on both issues. We knew that her will was with perpetual trustees, though that changed too over the decades to various lawyers. I made my first will in my early 20s, just before going abroad for the first time, though, like my mother at that age, I had nothing. My first exposure to death was at Cornelian Bay Cemetery, where Lehene and I played hide and seek among the tombstones. But we realized that we were there to place flowers at our grandparents' grave. My mother's father died when she was 15, a devastating experience for her as she adored him and he spoiled her. And she was left with a mother who thought her worthless because she was only a girl, not fit to be educated, fit only to work in the shop. Shortly before my grandfather's death, Archbishop Simmons mounted the stairs that catered to the palace over the shop. And he said, I'm not going to let your father go to heaven without the badge of a soldier of Christ. He told my Aunt Joyce, a fervent Catholic. And with that, he made the sign of the cross, sprinkled holy water, administered, placed sacred oil on grandfather's face, and so sent grandfather to heaven. When grandmother died almost 7 years later, the family coffers went entirely to the 3 boys. The 3 girls received virtually nothing, even though, like the boys, they'd all helped build the business. The girls could actually count themselves lucky. They hadn't simply been put in a bucket and drowned at birth. Just as grandfather wished to be returned to the motherland, so too did grandmother. Both parents expected to be returned to China or go back to China before they died. But that didn't eventuate. On Wednesday, the 5th of February 1941, the Mercury described Jin Jung Henry as a keen and energetic businessman, known for his kindness and charity, who gained complete mastery of the English language through diligence and perseverance. The family received a letter of condolence from the governor, Sir Ernest Clark, as Henry and Co. catered to the palace. My mother helped her mother dress her father in his best suit and shoes and placed crisp £1 notes into his pockets, the wherewithal in the afterlife. His body was placed into a specially made tin coffin, which was then in turn placed into a solid blackwood coffin. The idea being to disinter the body and repatriate it to China. But due to the Japanese invasion, the Second World War, and the Civil War between communists and nationalists, that didn't happen. And my grandparents' remains remain at Cornelian Bay. On my first destination overseas, Singapore, 1970, I wandered fascinated, imbibing the scent and atmosphere of the Chinese Chinatown in Singapore. I was fascinated in particular by what I came to regard as the funeral streets. Men in singlets and shorts hammered away, building wooden coffins. They stood them on their sides on the walls. They placed finished coffins behind the windows of the shops. Elsewhere, workmen built very tall paper wreaths, paper cars, stacks of paper money, all to be used by the deceased in the afterlife. Then in China, living there with my partner John Martin in 1984, we were invited to the memorial service of a senior editor of the English language China Daily. It was autumn, very, very cold, near zero, and mourners in thick padded jackets lined up to sign the long scroll outside. And inside, a picture of the deceased dominated the altar. An urn of his ashes below, covered with a red cloth for luck. White banners with Chinese characters naming the deceased. Gold banners proclaiming the virtues of the deceased. White is the color of mourning, though black is also used. White, the word in Mandarin, bai, means plain, neutral, plain, white, pure. And notice that the immediate family in their mouthsuits are wearing a carnation-like white flower. In Tasmania's sister state, Fujian, in southeastern China, John and I once chanced upon a procession of mourners, all wearing white jackets, some in white hats too. In Shanghai in 1985, the 12 million people were squashed into the world's most densely populated living area. But the 60 deaths per day meant that the crematorium and funeral people were looking for a burial place because there was no space, insufficient space for the living and insufficient space for the dead. But the funeral director was not hopeful of getting that space because of the scarcity. Funerals in China at that stage, burial for funerals at that stage, were limited to the privileged peasants. This is when the peasants really became privileged, because they could manage to have burial, and the sites of the burial were governed, dictated by feng shui, the direction of wind and water. As the funeral director told me in Shanghai, most Shanghainese simply can't afford burial. They would need to put aside half a year's salary to cover the cost of a burial, the transport, and a tiny plot outside of Shanghai. Nowadays, the policy is cremation for almost everyone in the cities. Though when I was there, just as I had witnessed mass marriages in Beijing, in the Beijing hotel, with 50 different couples all lined up to say their vows, kiss their new spouses together in the one space. In Shanghai at the time, I witnessed the preparation for a mass cremation. All the bodies lined up, draped in blue, except for one woman I noticed. She wore red. My paternal grandfather, Willie Chung Sing, who plied for most of his 87 years, he plied the Pacific, died back in China in 1952, and his memorial is on the site of his former Xinwei city home. But his burial with his wife is in a grave at a cemetery near his ancestral home. And my father, his youngest son, Charles, with his two sons, Philip and Christopher, in 2006 paid homage to Willie Chung Sing. They followed tradition and burnt incense. They took roast suckling pig and food and wine and paper money, all for the deceased's spirits, to nourish the deceased. Then they removed the food to consume themselves. Within 7 years of paying homage to his grandfather, Christopher himself died. And his funeral in Melbourne was the most Chinese-style funeral I've encountered down under, just as his marriage some years before had been the most Chinese marriage I'd witnessed in Australia. When my uncle, Gordon Henry, a pillar of the church and a fervent Catholic, died, his funeral was celebrated by 12 priests, all in white robes at St. Mary's Cathedral. It reminded Lehene and me of the 12 apostles. And at the new Pontefract Cemetery, he was given a Tasmanian burial with Chinese characteristics. A man went around giving everyone white envelopes with gold coins inside, for good luck, he said. As individuals, we follow different customs and have our own ways to grieve. For me, the deaths of my most beloved has been deeply personal and life-shattering. Experiences for which no emotional preparation was possible, and from which there has been no such thing as so-called closure. To me, closure is the most overused, misused, misleading word in English. I can close a door. I can close a book. But I can't close a deep emotion. For me, like physical pain, emotional pain is something with which I learn to live in different ways over different times. To me, grief can be eternal. It can be all-consuming. On Wednesday, the 29th of September, at 1:30 p.m., as I lay on my yoga mat on the floor beside John's bed, I heard a nurse enter the room. I stayed on my yoga mat, eyes closed, aware of the nurse and John. And then I heard my name, Helene, the nurse whispered. Instantly on my feet, I leant over John as he lay on his right side. Darling, I love you. I kissed him as the blood rushed from his face and he breathed no more. I began to cry uncontrollably, pressing my lips all over his now ashen face and sunken cheeks. My sweetheart was dead. I lingered over John's still, silent body for almost 8 hours. In disbelief, despair, but moving to quiet acceptance. Instinctively, I knew to telephone the Age and the Hobart Mercury to insert a death notice. Then friend, Jesuit priest and China scholar, journalist Michael Kelly arrived, and I heard myself ask, "Do you do funerals?" I left everything to him. I could no more speak at John's funeral than I could fly in the air. I left that to 3 men, including John's best friend from Utah's days, the taller John, John Thorpe. He had arrived that morning at 6:30 from Perth and spent time with John before he died. And when he returned in the early evening, just as I thought I might leave myself, I asked him to change his arrangements and come home with me. the guest room had already been set up for John's half-sister who came over the previous weekend. But when we reached home, I shall never forget opening the front door, switching on the lights, looking down the hallway into what seemed to me to be endless emptiness. After the funeral, our North Melbourne home was overflowing with people, with guests, relatives, friends, neighbours, and the fragrance of fresh spring blooms. I had never been so surrounded, yet so alone. As people milled everywhere, filling the house, it had never felt so empty. I longed for John. I expected him there. He would have enjoyed himself. I expected him to open the door, greet the guests, uncork the wine, pour the drinks, and pass around the savouries. It was such an eerie experience to feel his presence everywhere, but to know that he could not and would not, never would again be there. While my mother and sister were still staying with me, I tapped out a thank you note. I surprised myself by what I wrote. Thank you for your sympathy and support in the loss of John. He was my life and my love for 17 wonderful years. But in his illness, he showed extraordinary courage and asked me too to be brave. I'm consoled by the knowledge that I'm not alone in pain, but comforted by others, friends, colleagues, relatives, who share my loss and grief. I was with John when he drowsed into what would be his final sleep. And I stayed with him for those 4 long days and nights and held him in my arms and kissed him when he breathed his last. Now he is at rest. As I sat at my desk in my study at the top of the stairs, Lehene mounted the stairs, and I was embarrassed. She leant over my shoulders, and I didn't want her to see what I'd written. It was too personal, and she said so too. And yet, I would have the cards printed and posted out to everyone. I urged my mother back to Hobart and my sister back to London. I needed time by myself for my own thoughts. Something compelled me to write an account for myself of my last days with John. 7 months later, the telephone rang with ABC colleague Peter Couchman. He was planning to interview the Brisbane-based counsellor Doris Zadansky on her new book, Stuck for Words, What to Say to Someone Who's Grieving. He wanted me to join the program. Stunned, I agreed. While Doris and Peter were in a Brisbane studio, I was alone in a Melbourne studio, the same studio from which I normally presented a program at 5 o'clock each day called International Report. I couldn't believe what was happening. Live on air, answering their questions while I was crying on national live radio at midday around Australia. I received more letters from that broadcast than from any other broadcast. Thank you for telling things the way they are. Thank you for sharing your grief, but mostly for putting into words, for being the only one who has put into words exactly what I have felt since my husband died 3 years ago. So I decided to take what I'd written as a private memoir to the publisher of Stuck for Words, Hill of Content. And Michelle Anderson phoned me back that same day and said she would like to publish it.
It was the most uncomfortably hot night in Peking, about 30 degrees with high humidity, and as the sweat flowed down Rudolfo's face, Mimi's hand was anything but frozen.
Helene Chung Martin, listening to a radio report by her late husband on Pavarotti's visit to China in 1986. John Martin, an historian, died of cancer nearly 2 years ago. In her grief, Helene wrote this book, Gentle John, My Love, My Loss.
In the weeks and many long months that stretched ahead, I was to find myself totally absorbed in John. I would recall our simple daily routines, realize how I'd become so dependent on him and lost my own identity as a single person.
It tells about the change that the death of a partner can bring to a person. How grief has left its scar on Helene Chung, as I knew her in Melbourne in the 80s, who became the ABC's China correspondent, the high point in a career most would envy.
Report from Asia from Radio Australia. I'm Helene Chung Martin. And
how this fourth-generation Australian Chinese, born and raised in Tasmania, recognises the full meaning of a 17-year-old relationship, a relationship now lost. It tells how a precise, rarely frivolous person is confronted by an emotional and spiritual side of herself, which in the past she'd so often failed to recognise. Helene, you've told me, and you say in the book, that this wasn't something that you chose to write, but more a book that demanded to be written.
I felt since John died that I'd become part of a process, that I had been swept up by circumstances beyond my control, and the writing and the publication of the book is part of that, because it's quite uncharacteristic of me.
But you made a commitment there, didn't you? Were you ever concerned that you were laying bare such personal information?
That is my continuing concern, my continuing reservation, that I have exposed myself. I feel vulnerable because of this. How could I have allowed my private feelings to become public? Because I've been always a person concerned with other people's affairs, world events. I've been an objective reporter. But for the first time in my life, I've become a person not only concerned with my own feelings, but revealing them to others. I could never have discussed my feelings with anyone before, only with John.
Helene now looks to her garden, where John's ashes are buried, as a living reminder of her cherished companion. It's been a painful yet revealing process.
Grief was not a word I'd ever used. I'd never been in mourning, in grief. Suddenly, I was plunged, have been plunged into an abyss, a void, a feeling of emptiness, of meaninglessness, where there's no purpose, where all the professional and material attainments one might see as part of a successful life are irrelevant, because the one person who has brought meaning into my life is no more. And that's why I still feel that I lack a sense of identity, that I don't feel a person, because part of me has died.
In 1997, Lehene flew from London to Melbourne to meet her son. She was overwhelmed with joy. Mother and son bonded immediately. She had never felt such mutual love. 33 years earlier, when she became pregnant, she was abandoned by her boyfriend, an engineering student here at UTAS. She made the agonizing decision to have her baby adopted. Having been raised by a divorced mother, having suffered the stigma of a broken home, the stigma of being Chinese, she wished to spare her baby the stigma of illegitimacy. She wanted her baby to be raised in a conventional, stable, middle-class home, which he was, with an established, professional, progressive, middle-class couple interstate. The son flew to London, met Lehene's husband, and Lehene and the son, mother and son, luxuriated in time alone together. A year later, Lehene received a call from her son. He was in Melbourne, and he was passing on the wonderful news that he was to be engaged. Lehene was delighted. Yet, at the same time, she felt she had only just found him to lose him again. She felt a knife go through her heart. Within weeks, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. On hearing the news, Mama from Hobart joined me in Melbourne for a first-class Emirates flight, Melbourne to London. I would be away for 4 months, taking care of Lehene. Frail since birth, she was too weak to undertake chemo and/or radiotherapy. She chose complementary medicine. At first, she was well enough to hold a reception in London, and my usually shy sister stood before a crowd for the first time to make a speech, to introduce her son to her London crowd. She had enough strength to come to Sydney for the wedding. She had enough strength to take care of the young married couple when they stayed with her in London on their way to honeymoon in France. But over the next years since her diagnosis, her health wavered until in late 2000, she was diagnosed with water on the lungs. In the icy, snow-covered conditions which I'd previously enjoyed with Lehene, I now daily accompanied her by minicab via Hampstead Heath to 97 Harley Street, where she trusted and I hoped she would be cured. I waited while she received mega doses of vitamin C injected into veins of her arm. She was so confident, she prepared for Christmas. She even asked me how many mince pies to order for me from Louis the patisserie. But by Christmas, she was in hospital, having water pumped from her lungs. Despite orthodox medical opinion, she believed that she would recover to help other mothers cope with the pain of relinquishing their babies. When Mama arrived and placed her hands on Lehene, Lehene believed she was being healed. She told me that Mama, by staying with her in her room, was helping her get better. But that would prove her final week. Medical orthodoxy would prove itself against Lehene's chosen complementary medicine. On her final night, New Year's Day, 1st of January 2001, at 11:30 p.m., I stood rearranging her mohair blankets as she told me while sitting up in bed how she wished them to be placed. I then slipped out of the way while she continued using the remote pad to adjust the foot and head of her bed. A nurse stood to her left and another to her right, reading her pulse with an oximeter, I think it's called. Then I heard a low gasp. I immediately leapt to the base of the bed, and from her position against the back of the bed, Lehene looked towards me, ever so intently, as though stretching, straining for something just out of reach or just out of sight. A tear rolled from the outer edge of her left eye to be wiped away by the nurse on her right. She then, the nurse, lowered the head of the bed. She closed Lehene's eyelids. As I kissed my sister, I don't think I realized, perhaps I didn't want to realize, that in that lightning time, she had died. In the hours that Mama knelt, praying beside Lehene until the new dawn, she believed she saw her daughter smile. Next morning, Tuesday, we were obliged to leave the room while attendants changed Lehene's clothes. I heard the sound of a zip before we were admitted back into the now empty space. With permission, I took the stairs to the morgue and opened the door of a private room where Lehene lay stretched out on a pedestal in a white quilted body bag. I sat for a while contemplating my 57-year-old sister. Then I rose, unzipped the bag to reveal a face of tranquility. As Lehene lay in the powder blue garment I'd chosen from her wardrobe, I kissed Lehene. I spoke to her. Then, seated again, I closed my eyes to meditate. After an hour, I rose again, kissed Lehene, spoke to her, and zipped her up and returned to Mama. In death, Lehene's spirit and selfless love endure. Now cracks a fragile heart. Good night, sweet princess, and and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. At 89 years, my mother, Dorothy, was admitted into Melbourne's new Nonda Katsoulidis of Mona fame designed aged care facility. Recovered from a hemorrhagic stroke, bleeding on the brain, she didn't demur when told she couldn't return to live independently in her CBD unit. She'd first fallen over. The hemorrhagic stroke was caused by a fall in the dead of the night. But her first fall had been here in Hobart in her front garden. Despite years of yoga and headstands, her body couldn't overcome the rickets she'd suffered as a child through being weaned purely on rice water. As a result, Lehene and I were obliged to drink 5 Bunnikins mugs of milk a day. But she first suffered a stroke after a double bypass when she was 83. So by now, having overcome that first stroke, which totally paralyzed her right side, by now, 6 years later, she was accustomed to learning how to walk again, learning how to use cutlery again, learning how to be picked up again after falling over, picked up by 2 attendants, a net, and sometimes a machine. As I lived close by, I could take my mother home for lunch. I could take her to restaurants, theatres, concerts, and of course, various medical appointments. But in 2019, she enjoyed what would be her last Mother's Day lunch. Because when COVID hit at the beginning of 2020, routines changed. For weeks on end, no visits at all were allowed, though I could still take my mother food, flowers, collect and deliver her laundry, and have restaurant meals delivered when restaurants were allowed to operate for takeaway. But she spent her 95th and last birthday alone. She agreed that I could have delivered, or deliver myself as I did, some Hague's chocolate hearts for the other residents and all the staff on her floor, so long as her birthday was not mentioned. But she herself only wanted a single packet of dark chocolate almonds. When masked visits were allowed, or I was permitted to take her out, she had visibly deteriorated. She became less communicative, as though preserving her energy. But she still enjoyed my massaging her head, her arms, her limbs. All physiotherapy had ceased. Just before Christmas 2019, just as my mother had had her last major fall, broken her collarbone, and was confined to a wheelchair. On Tuesday, the 13th of October 2020, I took my mother some freshly shucked oysters, wild Australian prawns I pan-fried myself. She loved seafood. But today, she felt nauseous. She couldn't eat them. She asked me to bring in poached chicken legs next day, Wednesday. But that night, the telephone rang at 7:30 with a call from a doctor I'd neither met nor heard of. "Your mother's ill," he said. "She should be in hospital, but the notes here in front of me say she shouldn't be in hospital. She mustn't go to hospital." I said, "That's right. But could I give her some medication? She has pain all over her body." "Yes," I said, "but not that useless Panadol." "I'll give her a small dose of morphine." "Not too small?" I asked. Due to administrative details, she wasn't injected the morphine until I was there on the Wednesday afternoon, and the poached chicken legs were left untouched. She was then given the morphine, and I start playing to her a CD of Lehene playing the piano. Chopin, Beethoven, Liszt, Mozart. She ate no more, content with the peeled crimson grapes I popped into her mouth. Just before 9 p.m. on Saturday night, when a nurse was preparing to inject another dose of morphine, I noticed, "Oh, Mama's looking up at the ceiling." "Oh," said the nurse, "I'll go and get the supervisor." As I would write to my mother some days later, I shall never forget our last night together. When I held you and you opened your eyes so wide, wider than I've ever seen before. Then let your eyes close, but kept breathing as I could feel your chest move, but not breathing regularly, just spasmodically, until you breathed no more. No more, Mama. No more breath. No more, Mama. Only me to weep over you. After her regular GP arrived at 11 o'clock to write the death certificate, I climbed into my mother's bed and slept alongside her, just as I had done in the first few years of my life. On occasions, I propped myself up on my elbow to gaze at her serene, unblemished face. Next morning, the undertakers arrived, and I helped change my mother into her favorite wine-colored cashmere dress. I escorted the funeral pair down the lift to their van parked in the road and saw my mother in her coffin being slotted into position at the rear of the van. Unlike John's funeral, organized by Jesuit journalist Michael Kelly, unlike Lehene's funeral, organized by her husband at Golders Green Crematorium, a synagogue, in fact. My mother's funeral, in almost every respect, the writing of the death and funeral notice, the music played by her niece and her children, the celebrant Father Terry Rush, the black granite and gold lettering on her grave. All these details had been discussed with and approved by my mother years before. At the top of the camphorwood chest given to her by her father-in-law, at the top of this chest lay a quotation from Saint Teresa. Everything comes to an end, but the good or evil we do in this life is endless and eternal. As Shakespeare puts it, we are the stuff dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded by a sleep. And in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. In the words of Dylan Thomas, death shall have no dominion